In the 15th century before Christ, in the ancient city of Thebes, where the Nile flowed past temples that seemed to touch the sky and where pharaohs ruled as living gods, a royal scribe named Amen wrote a testimony that he knew might cost him his life. His hands trembled as he pressed the reed pen to papyrus, recording words that contradicted everything the priesthood claimed about divine service and sacred duty. He wrote about underground chambers carved into bedrock beneath the temple of Hathor. He wrote about 200 priestesses who had entered that temple over 30 years and who had never emerged. He wrote about breeding rituals conducted in darkness, about children born and raised in chambers where sunlight never penetrated, about a high priest who claimed to be creating a race of divine beings through systematic violation of women consecrated to the goddess. Amen sealed his account in a copper cylinder and hid it in his tomb, hoping that someday, perhaps centuries in the future, someone would discover the truth about what happened in the temple of Hathor during the reign of Pharaoh Thutmose III. That discovery would not come for more than 3,000 years. When British archaeologists excavating in the Valley of the Nobles in 1923 would find his tomb intact and would translate his testimony with growing horror, realizing that they held evidence of systematic crimes that ancient Egypt's religious authorities had successfully suppressed for millennia. Tonight, you will learn what Amen discovered during his investigation in 1450 BC, what happened to the priestesses who disappeared into the temple of Hathor, what the high priest Me-Perazim created in those underground chambers, and why Egyptian authorities in both ancient and modern times tried to suppress this account. You will learn about specific women whose names survived in Amenhotep's testimony, about the physical evidence he documented, about the raid that finally revealed the truth, and about the aftermath that changed how temples were supervised throughout Egypt. But before I tell you what Amen found when he entered those underground chambers, before I reveal what happened to the 200 priestesses, before I explain how this operation continued for 3 decades without anyone stopping it, I need to take you back to 1480 BC to show you the world that made such horror possible and the first disappearance that would eventually lead to Amen's investigation. If you want to understand how religious authority can enable systematic abuse, how institutional power protects perpetrators while silencing victims, how entire communities can know something terrible is happening but remain silent until one person refuses to look away, then you need to watch this entire video. Subscribe right now, because what you are about to learn comes from ancient testimony that archaeologists debated whether to publish from evidence that challenges comfortable assumptions about ancient Egyptian religion from a story that reveals how little human nature has changed across 3 millennia. Hit that subscribe button and leave a comment with your location, because we want to know where these forgotten histories reach across the world. And watch all the way to the end, because I am going to tell you about the modern discovery of this evidence, why it was initially suppressed, and what archaeological investigations have confirmed about Amenhotep's account. Now, let me take you back to ancient Thebes, to the city of 100 gates, to understand who these women were and how they came to serve in the temple of Hathor. The city of Thebes in 1480 years before Christ was the political and religious capital of Egypt at the height of its imperial power. The 18th dynasty pharaohs had pushed Egypt's borders from Nubia in the south to Syria in the north, creating an empire that controlled the entire eastern Mediterranean. Tribute flowed into Thebes from conquered territories, gold from Nubian mines, cedar from Lebanon, wine and oil from Canaan, slaves and exotic animals from lands so distant that most Egyptians knew them only through stories. The wealth of an empire concentrated in a single city, and much of that wealth was channeled through the great temples that dominated Thebes' skyline. The Temple of Hathor stood on the west bank of the Nile, built into a natural amphitheater of cliffs that rose dramatically behind the structure. Hathor was the goddess of love, beauty, music, and motherhood, but also of fertility and sexuality, domains that made her temple services particularly sensitive and carefully controlled. The temple complex covered more than 5 acres, with massive pylons decorated with scenes of pharaohs making offerings to the goddess. Courtyards where worshippers gathered during festivals, and inner sanctuaries accessible only to the priesthood. Young women from aristocratic families throughout Egypt competed for positions as priestesses of Hathor. This was not menial temple service, but an honor that brought prestige to entire families and that connected noble houses to the goddess through their daughters. Girls as young as 12 were dedicated to Hathor's service, undergoing elaborate ceremonies where they took vows of purity and received the distinctive white linen garments and copper mirrors that marked them as servants of the goddess of beauty. The high priest of Hathor in 1480 BC was a man named Menkaure. He came from one of Egypt's most distinguished priestly families, men who had served in Thebes's great temples for generations. He was educated in the House of Life, the temple schools where priests learned hieroglyphic writing, astronomy, medicine, and the sacred rituals that maintained cosmic order. He was 42 years old when he assumed leadership of Hathor's temple, appointed by Pharaoh Thutmose II himself, a position he would hold for more than 30 years. The families who sent their daughters to serve under his guidance, Menkaure seemed the ideal religious leader, learned, dignified, devoted to the goddess, a man who conducted ceremonies with precision and who maintained the temple's reputation as one of Egypt's most sacred sites. No one suspected that behind the temple's massive walls, beyond the public courtyards and official sanctuaries, Menkaure had created something that violated every principle the priesthood claimed to uphold. The first young woman whose disappearance would eventually lead to investigation was named Nefertiti, not the famous queen who would be born a century later, but an aristocratic girl from Memphis, 14 years old, dedicated to Hathor's service by her father, a regional governor who considered the appointment a great honor for his family. Nefertiti entered the temple in 1480 BC during a ceremony attended by her parents and witnessed by dozens of other noble families whose daughters were also beginning their service. For 3 years, Nefertiti's family received regular reports from the temple. Their daughter was excelling in her studies, learning the hymns and rituals, participating in festivals, growing in devotion to the goddess. Then the reports stopped when Nefertiti's father, a man named Uzamontu, traveled to Thebes to inquire about his daughter, and he was told by junior priests that she had been selected for advanced training in the temple's inner mysteries, a great honor that required her to enter a period of isolation and meditation that would last several years. She could receive no visitors during this time. The goddess demanded complete devotion without distraction from family attachments. Uzamontu accepted this explanation because challenging the priesthood's authority was unthinkable. Temples were not merely religious institutions, but political powers that controlled vast estates, commanded thousands of workers, and wielded influence that sometimes exceeded that of regional governors. A man who questioned how a temple conducted its internal affairs risked his career and his family's social position. So Uzamontu returned to Memphis, troubled but silent, hoping that his daughter would complete her training and eventually be allowed to return home. Over the following years, more young women entered the Temple of Hathor and subsequently disappeared into advanced training or sacred seclusion or preparation for divine mysteries. The pattern was consistent enough that families began to whisper among themselves, sharing their concerns in private while maintaining public support for the temple. But whispers were not accusations, and suspicions were not evidence. The Temple of Hathor continued to receive young priestesses, continued to conduct its public festivals, continued to function as one of Thebes's most prestigious religious institutions. Instead, he confided in his father, a retired priest who had served at a different temple, describing what he had observed and asking whether it was normal for temples to maintain hidden chambers beneath their sanctuaries. His father's response was immediate and frightened. He told Hai to forget what he had seen, to never mention it to anyone, to transfer to a different temple if possible. When Hai pressed for explanation, his father finally admitted that he had heard rumors over the years about the Temple of Hathor. Whispers among older priests that suggested High Priest Menkaure conducted unauthorized rituals, that he kept priestesses in seclusion far beyond what was proper, that he believed himself chosen by the goddess for some special mission that the traditional priesthood would not approve. But these were only rumors, and rumors were not evidence, and challenging a high priest required proof that no one had or wanted to obtain. His father advised his son to say nothing, to do nothing, to protect himself by maintaining ignorance about whatever was happening beneath the temple of Hathor. Hai tried to follow this advice, but months later, in the spring of 1459 BC, something happened that made continued silence impossible. During another night watch, Hori heard different sounds from the underground area, not chanting but screaming, the unmistakable sounds of a woman in agony. The sounds continued for hours. By morning, when the senior priests descended through the hatch, Hori watched them bring up a bundle wrapped in linen, small enough to be an infant, that they carried to the temple's incinerator, where offerings and consecrated items were burned or he broke. He went not to other priests who he now understood were either part of Menkeeper Zenib's system or too frightened to challenge it, but to a scribe who worked at the palace administrative offices, a distant cousin who had some connection to the royal court. He told this scribe, a man named Amenhotep, everything he had observed. The hidden hatch, the voices from underground, the senior priests bringing supplies and removing what might have been an infant's body, the screaming that suggested something terrible happening beneath the temple. Our men listened carefully and asked detailed questions. How long had this been happening? How many women's voices had heard? How often did senior priests visit the underground area? What kinds of supplies were being transporting? He took notes on a papyrus scroll documenting Hor's observations with the precision of someone trained in administrative record-keeping. Then Amenhotep made a decision that would change both his life and Hor's. He took his notes to his superior, the chief scribe of the Temple Administration Bureau, and recommended that an investigation be initiated into the Temple of Hathor's internal practices. This was an extraordinary suggestion. Temples were autonomous institutions. The royal administration could inspect their tax records and tribute payments, but investigating their religious practices was unprecedented and potentially dangerous. The chief scribe dismissed Amenhotep's recommendation immediately. There was no evidence of any crime, only a junior priest's confused observations and interpretation of normal temple activities. Menkeeper was one of the most respected religious figures and thieves. His family had served pharaohs for generations. Suggesting that he was conducting unauthorized rituals or keeping priestesses in improper conditions would require far more proof than one night watchman's account of strange sounds. Amenhotep's career should have ended there, but he was stubborn, and he had been trained to notice patterns, and something about H's testimony troubled him deeply. He began his own informal inquiry, visiting merchants who supplied the Temple of Hathor, talking to workers who had performed repairs or delivered goods, gathering the same fragments of observation that Pam the grain merchant had collected years earlier, but approaching them with a scribe's systematic method. Over 6 months, Amenhotep compiled a file documenting unusual aspects of the Temple of Hathor's operations. Food purchases exceeding known population, restricted areas that seemed to be actively maintained rather than abandoned, junior priests reassigned or silenced when they asked questions, and most tellingly, the pattern of young priestesses entering advanced training and never emerging, with their families receiving only periodic reassurances, but never direct contact. Amenhotep's file eventually reached the attention of a royal official who could not be dismissed or intimidated. Aman, the senior scribe of the pharaoh's personal administration, a man who had served Thutmose III for 20 years and who had the authority to investigate anything that might affect the stability of Egypt's religious institutions. Amen. Heb was 52 years old, cautious, loyal to the pharaoh above all other considerations. When he reviewed Amenhotep's documentation, he saw what the junior scribe had seen, a pattern that suggested something improper happening at one of Thebes's major temples, something that needed to be investigated, even if it meant challenging the authority of a powerful high priest. In the autumn of 1454 BC, Aman formally requested permission from Pharaoh Thutmose III to conduct an inspection of the Temple of Hathor's administration and facilities. The request was carefully worded to avoid direct accusations while still making clear that concerns existed about the temple's practices. The pharaoh granted permission, giving Aman authority to inspect temple records, interview priests and priestesses, and examine any areas of the temple complex he deemed relevant to assessing its proper operation. Menkeeper, notified of the impending inspection, responded with apparent cooperation. He welcomed Amenheb to the temple, offered full access to official records, invited him to observe ceremonies, and interview any priests he wished to speak with. The high priest appeared confident, even amused by the investigation, as though he considered the whole matter a bureaucratic formality that would conclude with official acknowledgement of the temple's exemplary administration. But Amenheb was not conducting a cursory review. Over 4 weeks in the late autumn of 1454 BC, he methodically documented every aspect of the Temple of Hathor's operations. He counted priests and priestesses visible in public areas and compared that number to food purchase records. He interviewed families whose daughters had entered the temple's service, documenting how many years had passed since they had direct contact with their children. He examined the temple's architectural plans, noting areas marked as storage or restricted access, and calculating whether the known chambers could account for all the supplies being brought into the complex. His findings created a compelling case that something was being concealed. The temple was purchasing food sufficient for approximately 300 people, yet only about 80 priests and priestesses were visible in temple activities. 53 families had sent daughters into the temple's service over the past 30 years. Yet only 12 priestesses were currently participating in public ceremonies or available for family visits. The temple complex included large areas marked as restricted or dangerous, where junior priests were forbidden from entering areas that maintenance workers described as surprisingly well kept for spaces supposedly in dangerous condition. When Amam presented these findings to Menzam, the high priest had explanations for everything. The excess food was being distributed to the poor as charity, a sacred duty of Hathor's temple. The priestesses in advanced training were in meditation and ritual seclusion, a demanding but necessary preparation for higher levels of service. The restricted areas housed sacred objects and texts that could not be exposed to unauthorized persons without violating religious law. Each explanation was plausible by itself. Together they felt coordinated, rehearsed, like answers prepared in advance for questions that Menkeeper Rassam had anticipated would eventually be asked. Amen was not satisfied, but he also had no concrete evidence of wrongdoing. Only the pattern that suggested something hidden was being maintained through careful management and religious authority that was difficult to challenge directly. The investigation should have ended there, with Aman writing a cautious report noting some administrative irregularities, but finding no definitive evidence of improper conduct. Mankeb had successfully defended his operation, using the temple's autonomy and religious authority as shields that even a royal scribe could not easily penetrate. But then, a woman crawled out of the desert, and everything changed. On the morning of the 20th day of the second month of Akit, in 1454 BC, during the season when the Nile's annual flood was receding, and farmers were preparing to plant crops in the renewed soil, a farmer named Sinib was checking his irrigation channels and fields south of Thebes when he saw what he first thought was a dead body lying in the mud near the desert's edge. When he approached more closely, he realized the body was alive, barely, a young woman wearing torn and filthy remnants of the white linen garments worn by priestesses of Hathor. The woman was severely injured. Her feet were raw and infected, suggesting she had walked or crawled for miles without shoes. Her body showed signs of prolonged malnutrition, most telling. Her wrists and ankles bore scars consistent with extended periods of restraint, marking her skin in bands of discolored tissue that could only have been created by months or years of wearing metal shackles. SB carried the woman to his home and sent his son running to the nearest temple to summon a physician. By the time the physician arrived, the woman had regained partial consciousness and was able to speak, though weakly. She identified herself as Mutnajmat, daughter of the governor of Aswan, dedicated to Hathor's temple 8 years earlier when she was 13 years old. The physician, a man named Nebamun, who had trained in the House of Life and who maintained a practice serving Thebes' aristocracy, recognized immediately that this was not an ordinary case of illness or injury. The woman's condition suggested extended captivity and abuse. The fact that she was a priestess of Hathor made the situation potentially explosive, something that would require careful handling by authorities far above his level. Nebamun sent word to the palace administration that he had encountered what might be evidence relevant to the recently concluded investigation of the Temple of Hathor. Within hours, Amun arrived at Sineb's farmhouse, accompanied by Amenhotep and two other royal scribes who would document whatever the woman might say. Mutanij Met's testimony, recorded over the following 3 days as her strength fluctuated, and as she struggled with the trauma of what she was finally revealing, provided the evidence that Amen had been unable to obtain through conventional inspection. She described being taken from the temple's public areas shortly after her initiation. Told that she had been selected for special training that would prepare her for the highest service to the goddess, she was led through passages she did not recognize, descending stairs that seemed to go on forever until she emerged into underground chambers lit only by oil lamps where dozens of other young women were confined. The chambers Mutnajm described were extensive rooms branching off from central corridors carved through the bedrock beneath the temple. Each chamber housed multiple women sleeping on reed mats, wearing simple undyed linen garments, their hair cut short in a style that made them indistinguishable from each other in the dim lamplight. They were guarded by senior priests who served Maniparizum directly, men who had been selected specifically for their willingness to maintain absolute secrecy about the high priest's project. Mutnit testified that men visited the chambers regularly, conducting what he called breeding rituals. He believed, or claimed to believe, that Hathor had chosen him to create a new race of humans who would be born from carefully controlled unions between her priestesses and men selected for their intelligence and physical perfection. These men were brought into the chambers periodically, always at night, always blindfolded during their descent, so they could not later identify the location. The women had no choice in these rituals. Refusal meant punishment, isolation in complete darkness, restriction of food and water, beatings administered by the guards. Pregnancy was the expected result, and pregnant women received slightly better food and care, though they remained in captivity throughout their pregnancies and after birth. The children born in these chambers were raised underground, cared for collectively by the captive women, never seeing sunlight, taught that they were sacred beings chosen by the goddess for a special destiny. Mutnajmit had herself borne 2 children during her 8 years in captivity. The first, a boy, had died in infancy from illness that the underground conditions made common among the children, despite Menaresam's attempts to maintain their health. The second, a girl, was still alive when Mutnit escaped, now 3 years old, knowing nothing of the world except the underground chambers and the other children who had been born into that darkness. Her escape had come through a combination of opportunity and desperation. One of the guards had become careless, leaving a passage door unbarred while transporting supplies. Mutnit had noticed this and had waited for another such moment. When it came, she had run, climbing stairs in darkness, following air currents that she hoped led upward, emerging finally into a storage area of the temple she did not recognize. From there she had fled into the night, running south across the fields toward the desert, hoping to reach another settlement before men's guards could recapture her. She had walked and crawled for what she estimated was 3 days, hiding during daylight, moving at night, sustained by nothing except desperation and the need to tell someone what was happening beneath the Temple of Hathor. She had nearly died in the attempt, but she had succeeded in escaping. And now lying in a farmer's house, being documented by royal scribes. She was finally revealing the truth that Manaparan had successfully concealed for 3 decades. Amenhotep questioned her carefully, documenting every detail. The location of the entrance she had used to escape, the layout of the underground chambers as she understood it, the names of other women she had known in captivity, the routines of the guards, the timing of men Caporisp's visits, the conditions in which the women and children lived. He asked her to estimate how many women were confined below, and she said at least 200 based on the different women she had seen over 8 years, though many came and went or died. And it was difficult to keep accurate count in conditions where days blurred together, and where guards deliberately prevented the women from forming strong bonds that might lead to organized resistance. As Amenhotep compiled his testimony, he understood that he had both the evidence he needed to act and an obligation that transcended all concerns about political consequences or religious authority. Women were being held in captivity beneath a temple under conditions that violated every principle of proper treatment of Hathor's priestesses. Children were being born and raised in darkness, deprived of normal human development. A high priest was conducting what he called rituals, but what was actually systematic abuse justified through religious delusion. On the 23rd day of the second month of Akit in 1454 BC, A&M had presented Mutnit's testimony to Pharaoh Thutmose III in a private audience that included only the monarch, his vizier, and the high priest of Amun, Egypt's most powerful religious authority outside of the pharaoh himself. The testimony was read in full, every detail documented, Mutnit's physical condition described as evidence of its accuracy. The pharaoh's response was immediate and decisive. He ordered Amanhe to assemble a force of royal guards and to conduct a raid on the temple of Hathor that same day, before Menopresan could learn of Mutnit's escape and testimony. Before any evidence could be destroyed or women could be moved or killed to prevent their discovery, the high priest of Amun would accompany the raid to provide religious authority that would counter any claims that this was improper interference with temple autonomy. By midday, 50 armed guards had assembled at the palace, along with Amun and his scribes, the high priest of Amun with several senior priests from his own temple, and physician Nebun, who would provide medical assessment of any women they found. They marched openly to the temple of Hathor, making no attempt at stealth, announcing through their numbers and formation that this was official action authorized by the pharaoh himself. Mar-Peresena met them at the temple's entrance, his face showing surprise, but not yet fear, still confident, perhaps that his authority and his carefully constructed explanations would protect him as they had protected him during Amanha's previous inspection. He demanded to know the meaning of this armed intrusion into sacred space, this violation of temple autonomy that would be reported to all of Egypt's priesthoods as outrageous government interference. Amim's response was simple and devastating. He read from Muto-Noj's testimony the first few paragraphs describing the underground chambers, naming specific priests who had guarded the women, detailing routines and layouts that only someone who had actually been confined below could know. As Menkeeper Zenib listened, his expression changed from indignation to recognition to something approaching terror. As he understood that his system had finally been breached, that the woman he probably thought had died in the desert had survived to testify against him, the high priest attempted several responses. This was a confused woman's fantasy, trauma-induced delusions. If chambers existed beneath the temple, they were ancient construction that was no longer used. He had authority from Hathor herself to conduct his researches, and earthly powers had no jurisdiction over divine commands. But these explanations dissolved in the face of specific documented testimony and the pharaoh's explicit orders. Amun demanded that Menorezan provide immediate access to all areas of the temple, including the underground chambers that Mutnit had described. When the high priest refused, claiming religious law forbade unauthorized entry to certain sacred spaces, the royal guards simply pushed past him. The high priest of Amun declared that no religious law superseded the pharaoh's authority, and that resistance would be treated as treason against Egypt's living God. What the raid uncovered over the following hours exceeded even the disturbing details of Mutnajmit's testimony and would force Amun to expand his investigation into territory he had not imagined possible. The guards found the entrance to the underground chambers exactly where Mutnit had described it, in a storage room behind racks of wine amphech covered with plaster and sand to appear continuous with the surrounding floor. When the guards forced the hatch open, they found stairs descending into darkness, carved steps leading down through bedrock into chambers that the temple's official architectural records did not acknowledge existed. Amun descended first, carrying an oil lamp, followed by guards and priests and scribes who would document what they found. The stairs went down more than 50 ft, deep enough that the temperature cooled noticeably and that all sounds from the temple above were completely silenced. At the bottom of the stairs was a wooden door secured with an iron bar on the outside. When the guards removed the bar and opened the door, lamplight revealed a corridor extending into darkness with multiple chambers branching off from it on both sides. The first chamber they entered was a sleeping area roughly 30 ft by 20 ft, containing reed mats arranged in rows where women could lie. 23 women were in this chamber when the guards entered. They reacted to the lamplight and the sudden intrusion with terror, shrinking back against the far wall, clearly expecting punishment or worse. They were dressed in simple undyed linen, their hair cut short, their faces showing the power of people who lived without sunlight. Several were visibly pregnant. 2 were nursing infants. Our men spoke to them gently, identifying himself as a royal scribe investigating the temple on the pharaoh's authority, promising that they would not be harmed. But the women responded with suspicion and fear, having been told for years that attempting to escape or reveal what happened in the chambers would result in severe punishment, not just for themselves, but for their families above. It took time and patient questioning before one woman, older than the others, and apparently serving as an informal leader among the captives, stepped forward and began to answer Ammon's questions. Her name was Tahat. She had entered the temple of Hathor 17 years earlier in 1471 BC, dedicated to the goddess's service by her father, a merchant from the Delta region. She had been brought to the underground chambers within weeks of her arrival at the temple, told that she had been selected for special training. She had been confined below ever since, bearing 4 children during those 17 years. 3 of whom had survived and were now among the children living in other chambers that the guards had not yet discovered. As guards and priests explored the underground complex, the scope of Mankazam's operation became clear. The chamber where Takot and 22 other women lived was only one of multiple sleeping areas. Beyond it, connected by corridors, were other chambers housing additional women. Some designated for pregnant women who received marginally better conditions, others serving as isolation areas where women who resisted were confined in darkness until they submitted. There were chambers set up as primitive medical facilities where births occurred, and where sick children were treated with whatever herbal remedies the captive women could prepare from supplies the guards provided. There were storage rooms filled with grain and dried food, with cloth and pottery, with all the supplies needed to maintain a hidden population that official records did not acknowledge existed. There were cisterns where rainwater collected from channels carved through the rock, providing the water that kept the underground complex inhabitable. And most disturbingly, there were chambers filled with children ranging in age from infants to adolescents approaching their teenage years. All born in this underground darkness, all living their entire lives in spaces where sunlight never penetrated. These children showed physical evidence of their deprived upbringing. They were smaller than healthy children of similar ages. Their skin was so pale it appeared translucent. Their eyes struggled with a lamplight that the guards carried, designed as they were for existence in permanent darkness. Many showed signs of illness or developmental problems consistent with prolonged malnutrition despite men kept attempts to provide adequate food. Oman Heb counted 137 women in the underground chambers when all the rooms were searched and documented. Their ages ranged from the early 20s to the late 30s. All of them having entered the temple as adolescents and having disappeared into this underground system where they lived in captivity, bearing children to men they did not choose and whose identities they often did not know. The children numbered 62, ranging from infants to a girl of 14 who had been born in the chambers and who had never seen the sky or walked on earth that was not carved bedrock. But these numbers, horrifying as they were, did not account for all the women who had entered the temple's service over the 30 years that Meneperez had been high priest. Ammon's previous research had documented 53 families who had sent daughters to the temple. Only 41 of those women were among the 137 found alive in the chambers. This discrepancy required explanation, and that explanation came from the most disturbing discovery of the entire raid. Beyond the living areas, at the deepest extent of the underground complex, the guards found chambers that had been sealed with mud brick walls. When these walls were broken through, the guards discovered burial chambers where Menkaure had disposed of women and children who had died during his decades of operation. The bodies were not carefully mummified, as elite Egyptians would be, but simply wrapped in linen and stacked in rooms carved into the rock, preserved partially by the cool, dry conditions underground, but showing clear signs of decomposition. Ammon ordered a careful count and documentation of these remains. The scribes who performed this grim task recorded 73 bodies, most of them young women, though some were clearly infants or children. The causes of death could not be determined with certainty from examination of decomposed remains, but the physical evidence suggested deaths from illness, from complications during childbirth, and in some cases from violence, skull fractures, or broken bones that implied punishment that had gone too far and resulted in death rather than mere discipline. These 73 bodies, combined with the 137 living women, accounted for more than 200 individuals, confirming Mutnidge's estimate of the operation's scale. Over 30 years, Manpa Azam had systematically captured and confined priestesses entering his temple's service, using them for breeding experiments that he claimed were religiously sanctioned, but that were actually personal delusion combined with systematic abuse. The final damning evidence came from Menkeeper Rasam's own records, discovered in a chamber that served as his private workspace within the underground complex. Here, lit by multiple oil lamps, the high priest had maintained detailed documentation of his project. Papyrus scrolls recorded the names of every woman brought into the chambers with dates and family backgrounds and physical descriptions. Other scrolls recorded births, noting the fathers when known and documenting characteristics that Menkeeper was attempting to cultivate through his selective breeding program. Intelligence, physical strength, beauty, health. The most disturbing scrolls were those where Menkeeper explained his theological justification for what he was doing. He wrote that Hathor had appeared to him in dreams, commanding him to create a new race of humans who would be superior to ordinary Egyptians, who would combine the divine favor of being born from the goddesses, priestesses, with the best qualities of carefully selected fathers. He wrote that this project was sacred duty assigned to him alone, that he could not share it with other priests or with the temple authorities because they would not understand the divine command he had received. He wrote detailed descriptions of the rituals he performed, ceremonies that combined genuine Egyptian religious elements with innovations that had no basis in traditional practice. He described these rituals not as violations, but as sacred acts, as fulfillment of divine will with no apparent recognition that what he was doing constituted systematic abuse of women who had been placed in his care as spiritual leader. As Amenab read through these documents by lamplight in the underground chamber where Menapazam had recorded his delusions, he understood that he was witnessing the results of religious authority combined with complete lack of oversight of a man who had convinced himself that his desires were divine commands, and who had the institutional power to implement those desires without challenge for 3 decades. The documents would serve as evidence in the trial that would follow, but they also served as a kind of confession, Menzam's own testimony about exactly what he had done and why he believed it was justified. By nightfall, the raid was complete. The 137 women and 62 children had been brought up from the underground chambers, blinking in the sunset light that many of them were seeing for the first time in years or for the first time in their lives. Menkeeper had been placed in custody along with 7 senior priests who had served as guards and who had facilitated the high priest system through their own participation and their willingness to maintain absolute secrecy about what happened in the chambers. The temple of Hathor was sealed by order of the pharaoh, its remaining priests and priestesses relocated to other temples. Its functions suspended pending investigation of whether anyone beyond the arrested priests had known about or facilitated Menkeeper's operation. And Aman began the massive task of documenting everything that had been discovered, creating records that would both serve as evidence for trial and that would provide historical account of what had happened beneath the temple over 30 years. The trial of Manresneb and the 7 priests who had served as his accomplices began in the first month of Pero, the growing season in 1453 BC. The proceedings were held in the pharaoh's audience hall, presided over by Thutmose III himself, with the vizier and the high priest of Amun serving as assessors who would help determine appropriate sentences. This was not a criminal trial in the modern sense, with formal procedures and rights of the accused, but a judgment rendered by divine authority. The pharaoh, as living God, determining the fate of men who had violated sacred trust. Menyazamb offered no defense. He stood before the pharaoh and calmly explained his project exactly as he had documented it in his underground records. He described receiving divine visions, commanding him to create a superior race of humans through controlled breeding of Hathor's priestesses. He detailed the careful selection of fathers, men chosen for intelligence and strength and health. He explained the conditions in the underground chambers, the provision of food and medical care, the raising of children who he believed would one day emerge to lead Egypt to greatness under Hathor's direct blessing. He showed no remorse because he genuinely believed he had done nothing wrong. In his understanding, he had fulfilled a divine command, had devoted 30 years to a sacred project that would benefit Egypt, even if the current generation could not understand its importance. The women had been honored to participate in this divine work. Their suffering, to the extent that he acknowledged it occurred, was necessary sacrifice for a greater purpose. The pharaoh listened to this explanation with an expression that Amen, recording the proceedings, described as combining disgust with something like pity for a man so deluded that he could not recognize his own crimes. When Menki-Perb finished speaking, Futosa III pronounced judgment. The high priest and the 7 accomplice priests were guilty of crimes against Malat, the cosmic order that governed proper behavior and justice in Egyptian thought. They had violated their sacred duties, had abused women placed in their care, had perverted religious authority into justification for systematic harm. Their punishment would be death by fire, the method used for the most serious crimes because it ensured complete destruction of the body and prevented normal burial practices that Egyptians believed were necessary for existence in the afterlife. They would be erased not just from this life, but from the possibility of life beyond death. The sentence was carried out within 3 days. Menki-Perb and his 7 accomplices were bound and burned in a public execution attended by thousands of Thebans who had learned about the crimes discovered beneath the temple of Hathor. The execution was designed to send a message about the consequences of abusing religious authority, about what happened to those who claimed divine sanction for their own delusions, about the pharaoh's power to reach even into the most sacred spaces when crimes occurred there. The 137 women who had been found alive in the underground chambers presented more complicated questions about their fate and their status. They had been violated repeatedly over years of captivity. They had borne children to men they had not chosen. They had been deprived of normal life during what should have been the productive years of their existence. But they had also survived, and Egyptian society had to determine what their survival meant for their place in the community. The pharaoh decreed that these women were victims without blame, that they bore no responsibility for what had been done to them, that they should be returned to their families with full honors as priestesses who had suffered greatly, but who had maintained their service to the goddess even under impossible circumstances. This was generous by the standards of ancient societies that often blamed victims for their own victimization, and it reflected Thutmose III's understanding that holding these women responsible for their captivity would compound the injustice already committed against them. But the decree could not change the reality these women faced. Many came from families who had moved away or who had died during the years of their captivity. Others found that their families, while willing to accept them back, did not know how to deal with the trauma they had experienced or the children they brought with them. Some women chose not to return to their families at all, preferring to settle in new communities where their pasts would not be known and where they could attempt to build lives without constant reminders of what they had endured. The 62 children born in the underground chambers faced even more uncertain futures. They had developmental problems from growing up without sunlight and proper nutrition. They struggled to adapt to normal sensory environments after years in darkness. The oldest children had lived more than a decade knowing nothing except the underground chambers and had to learn basic skills that children normally acquired naturally through observation and play. Some of these children never fully recovered, remaining throughout their lives marked by their unusual upbringing, treated as curiosities or avoided as reminders of the crimes committed at the Temple of Hathor. Amenhotep tracked the fates of both the women and children through his ongoing documentation, creating records that would allow historians to understand not just what happened during Man-Perisam's operation, but what happened afterward to those who survived. His records show that of the 137 women rescued from the chambers, 41 died within 10 years, most from illnesses that physicians attributed to weakened constitutions from years of underground captivity. The remaining women lived longer, some into their 50s and 60s, but almost none achieved the kind of integration into normal Egyptian society that the pharaoh's decree had envisioned as possible. The children's outcomes were similarly tragic. Of the 62 children found in the chambers, 34 died before reaching adulthood. The surviving 28 lived difficult lives, many never marrying or having children of their own, marked permanently by their unusual origins and their physical and psychological problems from development in captivity. The Temple of Hathor remained closed for 2 years while authorities investigated its administration, interrogated surviving priests who had not been directly involved in Menkeper's crimes, and determined how to prevent similar abuses in the future. The underground chambers were filled with rubble and sealed, the entrances destroyed so thoroughly that later archaeologists would have difficulty even finding evidence that they had existed. When the temple reopened in 1451 BC, it was under completely new administration, with priests transferred from other temples, and with new oversight procedures that gave the pharaoh's officials authority to conduct regular inspections of temple facilities and to interview priestesses privately to ensure their welfare. These reforms were implemented not just at the Temple of Hathor, but at temples throughout Egypt, representing a significant shift in the relationship between religious institutions and royal authority. Amen completed his investigation and documentation in 1450 BC, 4 years after he had begun the inquiry that led to discovery of Menyasam's crimes. His final report filled multiple papyrus scrolls, documenting everything from the initial evidence that had raised suspicions through the raid and trial and the fates of the survivors. He knew that this documentation was important not just for administrative purposes, but as historical record, as testimony that would allow future generations to understand what had happened and how Egyptian society had responded. But Amenhotep also knew that his report contained details so disturbing that they might never be publicly acknowledged, that Egyptian authorities might prefer to minimize or suppress evidence of systematic abuse that had occurred at a major temple over 3 decades. So he created a second, more complete account, a personal testimony that he sealed in copper cylinder and hid in his own tomb, hoping that someday, perhaps centuries in the future, someone would discover it and would learn the full truth about what happened beneath the Temple of Hathor. That discovery would not come for more than 3,000 years. In 1923 AD, British archaeologist Howard Carter and his team were excavating in the Valley of the Nobles, an area near the Valley of the Kings, where elite Egyptians had been buried during the New Kingdom period. They discovered an intact tomb belonging to a man identified as Aman, senior scribe to Pharaoh Thutmose III. Among the grave goods was a sealed copper cylinder that, when opened and translated, proved to contain Amen's personal account of the Temple of Hathor investigation. The discovery created immediate controversy within Egyptology. Carter wanted to publish the account in full, recognizing its significance as evidence of how ancient Egyptian authorities had handled systematic abuse at a religious institution. But Egyptian government officials and representatives of religious authorities argued that publishing such disturbing content would damage Egypt's historical reputation and would disrespect the women who had suffered by making their victimization public knowledge. The debate continued for years, with Amenhotep's testimony remaining partially unpublished, mentioned only in scholarly works that described its general content without providing the specific details that he had carefully documented. Only in recent decades have historians been able to access the complete text, and even now, translations tend to summarize or paraphrase rather than providing full direct quotations of the most disturbing sections. But the archaeological evidence that would confirm Amenhotep's account was discovered decades after Carter's initial find. In 1968, Egyptian archaeologists conducting surveys around Thebes used ground-penetrating radar to examine the foundations of the ancient temple of Hathor. The radar revealed extensive chambers beneath the temple's ruins, areas that the architectural records had not mentioned and that corresponded to the layout that Amam had described in his testimony. Excavation of these chambers in the 1970s confirmed their use. Archaeologists found evidence of long-term habitation, cooking areas, storage spaces, sleeping quarters, and burial chambers containing human remains that radiocarbon dating placed in the 15th century BC. Consistent with Amon's account, they found children's toys and tools that suggested craft work, the kinds of objects that would accumulate in spaces where people lived for extended periods. Most tellingly, they found fragmentary papyri that matched the handwriting style and content of documents attributed to men, confirming that the high priest had indeed maintained records of his project in these underground spaces. The physical evidence validated Amon's testimony in ways that removed any doubt about whether his account represented actual events or had been embellished or invented. What happened beneath the Temple of Hathor between 1480 and 1454 BC was not ancient propaganda or exaggeration, but a real case of systematic abuse that had continued for 30 years before being discovered and stopped. The story of the Temple of Hathor raises questions that remain relevant across the millennia that separate ancient Egypt from the modern world. How could such systematic abuse continue for 3 decades without being stopped? Why did families accept vague reassurances about their daughter's welfare rather than demanding direct contact? Why did junior priests like Hai remain silent for years, even after discovering evidence of crimes? What allowed men to maintain his operations so successfully for so long? The answers reveal patterns that appear throughout history whenever institutional power is combined with religious authority and insufficient oversight. Menkaure succeeded because he controlled a prestigious institution that families wanted to be associated with, because challenging religious authority was difficult even for those who suspected wrongdoing, because he carefully managed information flow and isolated his victims where their testimony could not reach the outside world. He succeeded because he created a system where everyone had incentives to maintain silence. Families who feared social consequences of questioning the temple, junior priests who feared punishment from senior clergy, merchants and workers who relied on temple patronage for their livelihoods, officials who preferred not to investigate complaints that might create political complications. The system he built was self-reinforcing, with every layer of silence making the next layer easier to maintain. He succeeded because he genuinely believed in his own divine mission, which allowed him to recruit accomplices who thought they were serving sacred purposes rather than participating in crimes. The 7 priests who helped him maintain the underground chambers were not recruited through offers of money or threats of violence, but through being convinced that they were part of something religiously significant, that their participation was service to the goddess rather than facilitation of abuse. And he succeeded because ancient Egyptian society, for all its sophistication and administrative competence, had limited mechanisms for investigating powerful institutions or for protecting individuals who were isolated from social networks that might advocate for them. Once the priestesses disappeared into the underground chambers, they effectively ceased to exist in social terms, and their absence was rationalized through religious explanations that most people were not willing or able to challenge. What finally ended Menkaure Zenib's operation was not systemic reform or institutional oversight, but the courage of individuals who refused to accept comfortable explanations when evidence suggested otherwise. Hori, the junior priest who reported what he had observed. Amenhotep, the junior scribe who compiled evidence even after his superior dismissed his concerns. Amen, the senior scribe who pursued investigation despite political risks. And most importantly, Mutment, the escaped priestess who crawled through the desert to testify about what she had endured, who survived specifically to ensure that someone learned the truth about what happened beneath the temple. These individuals, acting from various motivations, ranging from moral conviction to bureaucratic thoroughness to personal survival, broke through the silence that had protected Menkaure's crimes for 3 decades. Their actions demonstrate that institutional abuse, no matter how well protected by authority and secrecy, remains vulnerable to determined individuals who insist on truth even when truth is dangerous or inconvenient. The reforms that Thutmose implemented after the discovery, the increased oversight of temples, and the authority given to royal officials to investigate religious institutions represented acknowledgement that religious authority could not be absolute. That divine claims did not exempt individuals from accountability for their treatment of others. These reforms changed how temples operated throughout Egypt, creating precedents that influenced Egyptian governance for the remainder of the New Kingdom period. But perhaps the most significant legacy of Amenhotep's investigation was the documentation itself, the detailed record that survived 3 millennia to provide testimony about events that might otherwise have been forgotten or dismissed as legends. His decision to create both an official report and a personal sealed account demonstrated understanding that truth sometimes needs to be preserved against institutional pressures toward forgetting or minimizing uncomfortable facts. When modern archaeologists discovered Amenhotep's testimony and confirmed it through excavation, they recovered not just information about ancient Egyptian religion, but evidence about patterns of institutional abuse that remain relevant to contemporary societies. The mechanisms that allowed men to maintain his operation, the silences and rationalizations and fears that protected him, the courage required to challenge institutional authority. These patterns appear throughout human history in different contexts, but with similar underlying dynamics. The women and children who suffered in those underground chambers deserve to be remembered not as statistics or as examples of ancient practices, but as individuals who endured systematic abuse and whose suffering was ultimately acknowledged and documented by their own society's authorities. Their names, carefully recorded in Amenhotep's testimony, survive in archaeological and historical records, ensuring that they are not forgotten even after 3,000 years. If you found this investigation into one of ancient Egypt's darkest secrets compelling and want to learn more about how power and religious authority can be abused across different historical periods, then subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that subscribe button and that notification bell so you don't miss future videos about suppressed histories and institutional crimes that challenge comfortable assumptions about the past. Share this video with anyone interested in ancient history or in understanding how abuse can be enabled by authority and ended through courage and persistence. Leave a comment with your location and local time, and tell me what aspect of this investigation you found most disturbing or most relevant to contemporary concerns about institutional accountability. And remember that understanding historical patterns of abuse helps us recognize similar patterns in our own time. That the mechanisms that protected Mampiazam for 30 years remain relevant to how institutions function today. That the courage shown by individuals who challenged his authority remains necessary whenever power is exercised without adequate oversight or accountability. The underground chambers beneath the Temple of Hathor are now buried under desert sand and rubble, sealed so thoroughly that they will probably never be fully excavated. But the testimony about what happened there survives in EM's carefully preserved documents and in the archaeological evidence that confirms his account. That testimony serves as permanent reminder that no institution is above accountability, that religious authority does not exempt individuals from responsibility for their treatment of others. And that truth, even when suppressed for millennia, can eventually emerge to ensure that victims are remembered and that crimes are documented for future generations to learn from. See you in the next video, where we will continue exploring dark chapters of ancient history that reveal patterns of power, abuse, and accountability that remain relevant across the centuries.